the sword enthusiast is the 18th century shift from angular style saber mounts to round ones. This also affected the cross-section of scabbard and hilt, as we see in the following diagram. So here in the top we have the typical angular style. This is a 17th century peidao. On the bottom we have a 19th century saber with the round style, and I will now show you the cross sections. So in the top you see everything is quite square. The fittings are all quite straight, everything is a straight line. If you look at the bottom two diagrams, you can see that the hilt cross section and also the scabbard cross section are different. So the angular style has a squared off cross section with sharp corners. The rounded style has an oval cross section. Another notable difference is that in the round style, cloud heads are introduced. These are usually part of cloud collars that are used in several Chinese art forms. It isn't that apparent when you just look at a fitting, but if you fold them out, as I have done in this drawing, you can see that they form a series of cloud collars. These design changes didn't only affect swords, although only in swords the cross-section changed markedly. You would also find them applied to, for example, bow cases and quivers. To the left you have a woodblock print of 1766 with the classical early Qing style. To the right you have the same book republished in 1801, where you see the cloud collar shapes, or the cloud heads, applied in all corners of the bow case. These are three officers from around the 1760s, where you can see to the left he has a very classical Qing shape still. In the center you already see applied cloud heads, but very subtle. You just see the edges of them. And to the far right you see a more flamboyant adaptation where the cloud heads are a different color. These three portraits are from around the same time, but it shows different levels of adaptation. The next slide, this is an early 19th century set where you can see the cloud head motifs are everywhere. You cannot get around them anymore. These cloud heads have a very ancient origin. When you see to the left there's a bronze mirror of the Eastern Zhou dynasty to the Warring States period. This is around 840 to 222 BC. They surround a circle in the center. This design was adopted by many people influenced by China, including the Persians and the Mongols. The Mongols used to put these cloud heads on the top of their tents. You can see Qianlong with a Mongol-style tent on the picture on the right. The significance of these cloud heads, these early cloud collars were often seen on items resembling the universe. They surrounded the gate of heaven, an opening presumed to be in the skies where the pole star is, which was the gate to the heavenly realm. The cloud collars would be around this gate and would have 4 cloud heads in number, each representing a cardinal direction. On clothing, cloud collars marked the division between the material part of a person, his body, and the spiritual part, his head, just as the sky gate was believed to separate the material universe from the realm of the spirit. Another comeback from ancient art motifs during the late Qianlong period is Kuei dragon motifs. You can also see them on Zhou dynasty and Warring States items like this bronze hu. And they made their way to all kinds of saber designs. This is a peidao, probably an earlier blade than hilt. The hilt mounts are from around 1800, I think, showing almost exactly the same design as on these old bronze hu. The inspiration came, of course, from collections of high-level Qing officials that had collections of these bronze items, including the Qianlong Emperor. Now we've arrived at part 2, the when. When did these changes started? It's interesting to see that these changes seem to all be related to a single year. Here we have a page from a 1759 manuscript of the Guangqiao Liqi Tushe in the National Museum of Scotland. This is a hand-drawn manuscript that was later published as a woodblock edition in 1766. It is our main source for ceremonial regalia and arms and armor of the Qianlong period. This is a Zhenrei Ying saber, and it was presumably designed by Qianlong himself in 1748. The Zhenrei Ying at this point consisted of 300 of Qianlong's best men that were especially trained to overcome difficult terrain and fortifications. He personally oversaw their training, and you could equate them with modern-day special forces. The text reads, Zhenrei Ying Army Cloud Leather Saber, according to the design set in the 14th year of Qianlong, corresponding to 1748. And the rest is just the size, and it says it's similar to the style of the officer saber. The officer saber in question has a leather-covered scabbard, blue wrist lanyard, and blue silk handle wrap. Pretty much what we see on the painting as well. Another saber that doesn't have a date attached to it, but we can be sure it was designed before 1759, is a Qinhuang and Junhuang saber. These were imperial princes directly related to the emperor himself. He could also bestow this rank on men of special merit, one of the highest honors one could get during the Qing. This is the description. It shows how long it is and what kind of materials could be used. And it also says that the Eastern pearl is forbidden to use because this was only for the emperor himself and people that he specifically said could use them. 1748. This is quite a year for Qianlong, a tough year. It started at New Year's Eve, 1747. The Qianlong emperor lost his son and heir, Yongchong, to smallpox. He had high hopes for this kid. He named him heir, and it was the second child that the love of his life bore him, Empress Xiao Shanchun, also known as Lady Fuka. April 8th the same year, he lost her. She was the love of his life. They were extremely close. They married when he was still a prince. And he seemed to have lost his mind a little after she died. He applied extremely harsh punishments for whoever he thought didn't mourn deeply enough over her death, including some of his sons that were demoted. I don't know if it was a coping mechanism or maybe a fear of bad omens for the dynasty at large, but from this moment onwards, Qianlong started to obsessively involve himself with the most minute details of state affairs, including the design of weapons for his men, for example. Why? Qianlong ruled over vast lands, including many peoples. He was very aware of his minority status as a Manchu, and he was always trying to legitimize Manchu rule over a vast Han majority. Here you see Qianlong in his hunting capacity, hunting with his imperial guardsmen. And to the right you see part of a 5-language dictionary that shows all the languages of the realm that he ruled. And he really wanted to keep everything together by pointing out the similarities between all these people. So for example, in the same work, the same Guangqiao Liqi Tushe, he describes his own saber. This is Heaven Series number 1, one of the best sabers he had. This is the sword that he would wear at the Grand Review of the Troops, a great martial spectacle held in Beijing every 3 years. What he did was he digged through old texts to find parallels between Manchu custom and Chinese tradition. So what he found was this reference in the Book of Later Han, the Ho Hanshu. Wearing peidao when on a vehicle, the blade is widely decorated with gold inlaid patterns. The scabbard is half covered with ray skin decorated with slim golden lines in pattern in yellow color with colorful fittings. What's interesting about this is the word peidao, because Manchus would wear the waist-worn saber, but traditionally the Chinese elite, including their emperors and their higher officials, would always wear the straight sword. The saber would be something a little bit frowned upon, and it was looked down upon as being too martial, too military, and it was a thing for soldiers and for barbarians. So Qianlong must have been very happy to see a reference to a Peidao used by someone this early on, and this describes the custom of the Duke of Zhou, who was an historical hero of classic Chinese literature. Interestingly, in this period of time from which this text dates, the Peidao wouldn't have been a curved sword, but a straight sword with a single edge. But because the wording is the same, I think Qianlong hoped that nobody would know these intricacies about really early sword design. Later, he even commissioned a saber with the golden lines on the scabbard, exactly like the description in this later handbook. My conclusion. Reapplying ancient Chinese art motifs with deep spiritual meaning and referring to ancient texts of customs resembling Manchu ones was a way of legitimizing Manchu rule. Qianlong was basically saying, see, we are not so different. The cloud head design perfectly fit into Qianlong's narrative, an old symbol associated with the heavenly gate of ancient Chinese religion, still used as such by his Mongol allies. Clouds are also symbolically significant because the emperor was the son of heaven, operating under a heavenly mandate. His troops were called the heavenly troops, supposedly executing heaven's will. It fitted Qianlong's idea of keeping it all together through shared symbolism. Thank you.
Thank you. I am very grateful for your invitation to speak here and to meet so many friends and colleagues. And I was just to show some points about the Destreza books in America. It is to remark there was a spreading of fencing across continents, also across countries, and also across different cultures. First of all, some images here are are not to be used without previous consent. We must define what is destreza, because when we speak about destreza, we are referring to specifically a combat system that was based in scientific, philosophical, ethical, and religious principles. It was prevalent in the Hispanic world during the modern age, is to say the 16th, 17th, 18th centuries. And you have to mark some of his characteristics is that they tend to spare your life, to self-defense before to be aggressive, and also to be based in Christian principles. What is remarkable of these systems, as a previous presentation has said, that it was very clearly defined. It has an interior structure that can be found from the beginning until the almost 3 centuries that it was in use in Spain and Hispanic countries. It has some consistency. Masters of Destreza were quarreling between them all the time and calling words one to another. But if we see the Destreza text of Destreza master from outside, we clearly can identify that it is Destreza and what is not Destreza. And so, just to put in perspective what was the Hispanic parts of the world that were under direct or indirect control for Spain and Portugal, but for some years they were united in one monarchy. Is from many parts of America. they have presence in parts of Africa, even in Asia, in India, Indonesia, Philippines, and other parts. And in Europe, there was a strong part, not only in the Spanish peninsula, but also in the Low Countries, in parts of France, Netherlands, northern Italy, southern Italy, that were under direct rule by the Spaniards for some years. In this year also happens what somebody has called the first globalization. It was because of this widespread dominion of Spanish and Portuguese, they established trade routes that cross the oceans and connect continents, and also set some kind of trade routes that include several continents. There were commerce coming from Spain, going to America, and from America to Asia, to Philippines, where there was a trade hub where a lot of commerce from Japan, China, and the Southern Island, they were convenient there. Mainly, the Spaniards bring silver, and they take from Asia manufactured goods and luxury goods. They traveled with it across the Pacific Ocean to Mexico, then cross by land, and they re-embarked en route to Spain. And the Portuguese covered Brazil, Africa, and also India and some parts of Indonesia and Timor Island and the other parts. Even in this year, with the Keicho embassy, this was a Japanese and a diplomatic envoy to Spain, trying to establish closer relationships. There were some contacts between Spain and principally the Pacific coast, but later there was some political problems and these efforts were short-lived. Then, now we are going to start with one person who was taken as the founding father of the Destreza. It was Jerónimo de Carranza, was born in Seville. This is the aspect of Seville in the 16th century. Seville was the most important city in Spain because here was the river harbor where all the fleets that go to America were formed here. But for the beginning, the Spaniards make the trade with America not by isolated ships, but they form fleets to protect the commerce. There was an interior in the center of Andalusia, in the river Guadalquivir, and so they can bring the goods well into the inside of the country. The first book that actually you have from the Destreza is the book is called The Philosophy of Arms and His Destreza and the Aggression and Defension of the Christians. It was printed in the house of the author in 1582. From then, it is taken as the first book of the Destreza. The Carranza, the book was printed in Spain, but the rest of the life of Carranza was spent in America. He traveled to America. He was governor of the province of Honduras in Central America. Actually, this was a part of America. This is a very difficult part, because this was little populated, and they have problems with pirates and some other concerns. And so Carranza was provided as governor. Is to say that a kind of civil and military authority. He has traveled with the church there because he was a very right man, and he tried to make the law that was to apply. But the local priests, they don't have many friendship with him, and he was even excommunicated. Well, there is a very long story for another day. Some years later, this is the first book that was published in first fencing book that was published in America. It's in the last part of the 17th century. It is published in Guatemala, which is very near Honduras. And the author claims to be a pupil of Carranza, claims to be a member of the Seville school, but in Destreza, although it was a very monolithic system, there were some different schools for different trades. And this is important, but from some years, it was published before other books that were published in North America. The next author we are going to speak is Francisco Lawrence de Rada. He was born in north Spain, Laredo, in 1660, and his life started as a soldier, as a marine, naval infantry. He reached the degree of colonel. And we don't have portraits of him, but we have a portrait of the ship he was serving. This is one ship built at the last of the 17th century in the north of Spain, and he traveled extensively in south of Spain, and also he spent a lot of time in Italy, where he learned in the southern Italy, where he learned the Italian systems. And also he can write with a knowledge of this system of combat. He writes a lot of books. When he was in Madrid, wanting to have his promotion, he has time to write a book that is Respuesta Filosófica. It is a philosophical answer to the questions of Destreza. But this same year, when he was in Cádiz, in the south coast of Spain, wanting to come on board, he has time to write another book, this called Crisol, that is a book that is very scarce, only 2 copies. One is in Madrid, and another one is in Mexico Library. Both of them are incomplete, and now we have make a new edition with, we reunite all the copies and make a complete edition for the first time. Then Lawrence de Rada went to America. He was provide governor of Veracruz. Veracruz was important, as we speak before, was the port of exit of the goods from Mexico to come to Spain. Silver, also American goodies, and also from all the goods that come from America. And when he was there, he has time to publish another book. You see, the people there were no entertainments, and they have time to write books. And this is also very scarce, only 1 copy in the Library of Mexico. This man has a a very long career and traveled two times between Spain and America and back. This is not usual because usually people go once, perhaps 2 times, but it was not usual to make the travel several times. And when he was coming back to Spain in the fleet with all the treasure, they were followed by a British Dutch fleet, and they have to take cover in the Bay of Vigo in the north of Spain, where all the fleet was burned and perhaps part of the treasure was lost. Then Lawrence de Rada, as a military, was in charge of part of the defenses of the city of Vigo, and he said that he has lost a book he has written when the fleet was burned, but he has time to reconstruct it in a few years later. He can publish, this time in Spain, a big book that is considered as the main principal book about destreza. It's comparatively late. We see that it's in the beginning, in the 18th century, and the other books were published just 100 years before. But in this book, this is 2 volumes, and more than 1,500 pages, a lot of plates. There is a very, very complex and complete explanation of all the destreza system. Then we have another time crossing the Atlantic, and this time Lawrence de Rada went to Mexico City. This time as a registrar, and this is a more important position because he has to supervise all the transactions and records, and they get a fee for each of his facts. And in fact, he get a big fortune. This is the score of Mexico in this time. When he was there in Mexico, there was another publication of a book, this time in South America, in Lima, when some people write to Lawrence de Rada and say they have set a new system. They call it destreza indiana, is to say the destreza from America. Then Rada writes an answer to this book, very angry, and say that this was nonsense, that the destreza was the true system, and they were wrong. The people from South America claims that the system was original, but Rada says that this was exactly the same as Italian system, and so there was a debate between them. Some years later, almost 100 years later, we have seen that we're reaching the 3 centuries span. There was published in Mexico City a book, this time about saber. Saber was for them a new weapon, but the destreza master tried to incorporate it into the destreza system, and they write how to use a saber with the principles of destreza. And we saw here that there were some kind of protections for the fencer, also a protection in the tip of the saber, and the use of hats. The hats was intended as a protection also. They were not wearing masks yet. And the writer of this book is maestro de todas las armas examinado. Is to say, this is an official master of the destreza, because the destreza, as Marco Ferrari has said before, was a system that was officially approved, and they, the master have to have an examination and have to have records to recognize them as an official master. If anybody was teaching fencing without the proper title, they can be prosecuted. Nearly coming to the end, now Mexico was independent, and in 1833, this was published a book, and they here are joining America and Asia again, because the author was Roman Punzalan. This was born in Philippines. Probably his father was Philippine and the mother of Spanish stock, because for the family names in Spain we use two family names, the first from the father and the second from the mother. No? He was has a French, spent some time in France and learned fencing there. And he said that he has influence from Danet, a French author, and from Lawrence de Rada, another author. And this book, you can see that it's mixed between destreza and French systems. We see that in the 19th century, the French system was taking ground to the destreza almost to replace it almost completely at the end of the 19th century. And just to finish, just to say that see that the destreza has these deep roots in the Spanish society. This was incorporated in the American environment, and this also two of the main authors of destreza, that is Carranza and Lawrence de Rada, were present in America. There were also different interpretation of the system, and there was a rich interchange between different American territories. Thank you. Thank you very much.
Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. I'm very excited about this discussion we're about to have. Unfortunately, because of the limitation of time, I can only conduct this panel in one language. And as you can see, we have a very international composition here. So I will speak mainly in English, and where necessary, I will translate into Chinese. I have prepared a list of questions ahead of today's panel, but I don't think I'm going to ask any of them, because over the course of today, we've had a number of really brilliant presentations that have opened our perspectives on how we understand martial arts from different countries, different regions, different cultures. But I still want to start off with this question on whether a nationalist discourse is helpful to understanding martial arts development, martial arts identity in general. In the last few presentations, notably in Marco Ferrari's discussion about the development of Italian fencing in the 17th century, we have seen where nationalist discourse as well as cultural discourse actually come together, where within a single country, in southern Italy, where interaction with what's happening elsewhere in Europe, barring perhaps with Spain, the interaction is much less, where local traditions are preserved to a much greater degree, as opposed to northern Italy, where since time immemorial almost, penetration for our countries, for other cultures from beyond the Alps have been ongoing, and this is reflected in the very divergent martial art development in the south and in the north, respectively. In more modern times, we have seen countries like Japan, and also we have heard from my teacher, Professor Ma Mingda, who talk quite heavily in sort of nationalist terms about martial arts. So I would like to start off with Eric. When we talk about martial arts in general today, we'll often talk about Chinese martial arts, Japanese martial arts. Why is that? And do you think it's helpful?
Yeah, thank you for the question. I think it depends on who you're talking to. So if you're talking to someone you just met on the street who doesn't know anything about martial arts, this might be helpful because people get an impression what you're talking about. So it's like, I would compare it to opening a restaurant. So if you're opening an Italian restaurant, it might be helpful to label it as an Italian restaurant because people will expect pizza and pasta. So people get an impression because you use these nationalist terms. But at the same time, if you're going into more detail and you're really looking at the practices, I think it gets more of a burden, I'd say, because you're actually the practices are much more diverse and much more complicated and much more interrelated than those national lists or those national boxes will allow to put into. So I would say if you're really trying to understand what's happening on a cultural level, those boxes are more of like a shorthand to say, well, these are directions, but in the same time, they might hinder us to understand what's going on.
Thank you for that. So between how lay people look at martial arts and when we're trying to explain martial arts to lay people, I suppose the cultural expert perhaps will choose to use different terminology, different ways of presentation. However, in my personal view, I also think that in the process of building cultural identity, particularly in more modern times, with the birth of the nation state, states are actually active agents in the construction of nationalist discourse and nationalist identity. For example, we'll talk about Muay Thai, where in fact we know that that fighting tradition had a very profound influence from southwest China on the one hand, and also very close parallel and interaction with Cambodia and with Burma on the other hand. So if you sort of wear your scholar's hat and talk about the relationship with this project of nationalism and the building of nation states and national discourse of martial arts, could you shed light on that?
Well, I mean, you can also see this in the Middle Ages or in the early modern period. Like people start, like George Silver, start to complain about other foreign masters. So it's always the way you fight and the way you are curating your martial system is linked to identities, and identities are at the in a world which is organized by national states, identities are also linked to national states. So yeah, I would agree that it's also sort of a national project to promote certain martial arts as being part of a specific culture.
Any examples?
Yeah, well, of course, in Japan you have very much the Budo tradition. You have the Wushu thing in China, and all other martial arts in China which are closely related to Chinese identity and martial culture. You have like fencing, which is divided in between, like Olympic fencing, which is divided between France and Italy. At the moment, I think the FEA is the central organization, so it's France who's winning at the moment in fencing. But yeah, it was different. It was even competed in early modern times.
Many thanks, Eric. I think I'm going to give you a breather and turn my attention to Daniel. So we have spent a little bit of time between me and Eric bouncing back and forth, discussing the relevance of nationalist approaches to understanding meaning and development of martial arts in a more contemporary setting. But if we cast our gaze back into the past, when we talk about historical traditions, particularly in Europe, is it helpful to talk about things like Spanish tradition or German tradition or Italian tradition?
Thank you for this question. As we saw, language plays an important role, but also martial arts cross the boundaries between language because then they are translated, martial contexts and texts. However, it goes beyond this, I would like just to point out that we have a very different ideas about national identities in the 19th century in the construction of nation states. If we apply these ideas to the Middle Ages or early modern period, we can find connections and similarities, but also divergences. For example, we now regard Italy as a land. It was a competitive state of cities where each of them were seen as their own independent nation. Also, we can still see this in the discussion by Marco Ferrari between the North and the South divide in the texts. So I remember studying a text about Pietro de Monte, who is an author. He was also a military captain, and he hired mercenaries. And the idea of competition or competitive on the battlefield is also associated with nations. So parties and techniques, we have to fight innovations, find counter-response, and it's the same with martial techniques. He has a part when he describes wrestling. He says, if you want to defeat a German, you should do like this. If you want to defeat an Italian, you should do like this. And forget about the French or the belts. It's not important.
Thank you for that, Daniel. Indeed, I was also quite inspired by the panel, by some of the presenters earlier today when discussing about local tradition, that they also studied so-called foreign masters, foreign styles to come up with solutions to overcome that. If we cast our mind back into China, particularly during the Ming Dynasty, when there was a lot of cultural disturbances by the so-called Warko, so Japanese powers, but in effect, of course, as we all know, as a historical phenomenon, the composition or the ethnic composition of the Warko was a lot more complex. There were different nationalities involved, and there, among the leaders, there were many Chinese, and collusion of Chinese villagers and rebels, of course, were also heavily involved in this phenomenon. In this regard, what is interesting is that we have noticed that Chinese martial arts scholars at the time were actually responding actively to the threat of the Japanese two-handed sword, which they really struggled to deal with. So they actually studied the Japanese sword, both trying to imitate, incorporate the techniques, so technically, as well as in terms of the manufacture standard and in terms of use of weaponry, of imitating the Japanese sword. Maybe on this note, I will pass it to Mr. Liu to see what your thoughts and reflections are when we talk about Chinese martial arts. Because China is such a big country, as we saw from Professor Ma's presentation at the start of today, that Chinese concept of the body, of movement and of martial art essentially transformed significantly over thousands of years. 我用中文简单重复一遍。我们之前大家是大概聊了一下那个从国家的那个角度，当我们去谈武术的发展的时候，从国家的观念去理解这个武术，这个是否有帮助，或者是有害？那么，最早那个 Eric 先生他说，就是对于一般老百姓来说，可能对于这个武术是比较陌生的。有的时候我们讲日本武术啊。中国武术啊，大家会比较容易去接受。但是呢，如果我们深层一点再去看这个武术的时候，其实它很复杂。那么在不同的年代，其他的那个像Daniel先生刚才也讲了，我们今天谈的中国，我们今天谈的意大利，跟过去可能差别很大。就比如说我们回到17世纪的时候，意大利并不是统一的国家，所以意大利我们今天讲的可能是一个国家的概念。在17世纪的时候，它讲的是文化的概念。当我们把这个舆论再放回中国的时候，到底我们说中国的武艺对整个东亚地区的武术的理解上，到底它是否有帮助？
这个议题，我想说，可能是比较类似，因为中国经历过，中国是一个比较笼统的一个概念，它有朝代的一个问题。那中国武术在历朝历代以来，它的武术的那个定义跟演变是不一样的。所以今天呢，我们来探讨说，用中国或者是用日本，或者是用其他一种国家或民族的概念来谈这个武术的时候，事实上它的范围太广阔了。就以中国来说的话，就是你今天谈中国武术， 你是明代的，还是清代的，还是民国这个时期的？而且南方跟北方跟华中的武术风格是大异其趣，所以今天来不要说是民族与民族之间，就是光我们以中国来说的好，光在这么小的一个区域里面，我们要理解什么叫我们自己国家的武术。这个上，就有一点像是比较困难一点的。但我想说，一开始的时候，我们要从文化的角度上来说，我们要先认识自己。就是初期的时候，那可能我们会用我们自己国家来做一个定位，我学的是什么武术。可是到中期来说的时候，就是说，在学习的过程里面，你会在切入点上不断的去深入，就是我是学中国武术的，我可能就是学中国武术，我的定位就是在这个地方，我可能不了解其他民族的武术，而且其他的民族的武术，就像说，在中国古代的时候，它是几乎是除了战争之外，它是没有机会接触到其他民族的武术，他们可能是概念是比较薄弱、比较陌生的。像中国跟那个时候发生过几次战役之后，明朝那个时候战役是比较多的。那可能因为这样子的关系，慢慢就是会形成中国武术跟其他武术，像跟日本好了，那时候跟日本武术慢慢会形成这样子的概念。那可是，在后期进入到像现在跨文化比较研究的时候，事实上这个民族主义并不见得是一个坏事，对我们理解各民族的。可是这个时候呢，我们大部分的人来说，对武术的研究应该已经进入到一个相当深度、相当有文化深度的一个程度，才可能会涉及到这样子的一个问题。我想说，今天我们今天在这个场合里面，我们接触到了很多是西方的武术。那我想说，在座的很多人可能跟我一样，以前可能没有接触到欧洲的一些武术。那对我们而言呢，这可能是比较陌生的。那如果提邻近的，你提日本武术、韩国武术，对我们来说可能有一点点意义。可是你提到欧洲的时候，可能太遥远了。那这种民族主义的这种色彩，对我们来说，事实上并不会有直接很大的一种影响。
Okay, I see that maybe the translation it's not fully functioning, so I'll try to provide a summary of what Mr. Liu just said. First of all, China is a very broad concept. China is very big as a country, so if we look at China spatially, from one area to area, from one terrain to another, there is a huge amount of variety. And then there are dynastic changes. So China is also extremely diverse. And as we saw from the first presentation from Professor Ma Mingda, the concept of the Chinese body, the concept of what underlies martial arts and what's important in martial arts is the process of negotiation. And through time, the understanding and hence the practice also evolves. So Chinese martial arts, it's abstract in that sense, in the way that it's extremely diverse and it differs significantly across both time and space. However, the third dimension that Mr. Liu talked about is the question of cultural identity. When we look at Chinese martial arts today, he thinks that such nationalist discourse about China, particularly if we look at this Chineseness as a cultural construct and potentially as a way for people to reconcile or embrace their Chinese cultural identity after all the disruption that's happened in the past, it could actually be quite helpful. And he uses the performance last night as an attempt to allow people new ways to embrace Chinese cultural identity through the martial arts. Not sure if this is a very accurate translation, but I try my best. Okay, so moving on. If we open up the discussion a little bit, I hope most of you have had a chance to look at the exhibition on the ground floor. Most of you will have noticed that the exhibition really started with manuals and books, 5 books, starting from the 16th century. I believe both in East Asia and in Europe, 16th century is an important time of change. And indeed, 16th century marks the dawn of globalization. Personally, I was hugely inspired by Manuel's presentation just now, where in the past, not so long ago, I was really looking at the Strezza as primarily an Iberian phenomenon. But you showed us that from the very beginning, it was a Hispanic tradition, and therefore it's transnational. I would like you, if you can, to expand a little bit more about the development of the Strezza and how it's related to this transnational diaspora that connected the whole world.
Yes, the Strezza, the origin is clearly Hispanic, probably in south of Spain, in Seville. But also we know that in Seville there was a strong Italian colony, and there is some people claim there are influences of Agrippa and that this kind of geometry in the first developing of the Strezza. So we have to start with some interactions. Later, the Spaniards were in Italy, northern and south Italy, and as Marco Ferreri said, the Italian has a close contact with the Strezza, both in the north of Italy and then in the south. And the sort of school of the south of Italy probably develops against the Spanish Strezza, because this kind of very quick solutions, and they try to avoid the contact of the blade that was very particular of the Spanish. This was a system that is created against the Strezza. And so the Strezza has to react, and he created his own system to counteract the Italian system, because this was an armament run. They have to see that they were losing against the Italian, and they have to develop a new system inside of the Strezza to confront the Italians, because they were becoming a very, very thought enemies. No?
Thank you, Manuel. I have 2 questions. One is a bit of a divergence, for which I apologize. But I'm personally fascinated by the fact that already in the early 16th century, late 15th century, Spain was an emergent power, and which subsequently became dominant in Europe and indeed around the world. Yeah. And Spanish soldiers were actually much feared around the world, particularly on the European battlefield. But there are specific ways of fighting, and hence martial arts, which the Spaniards were known for. For example, the sword and buckler. Is that something that was preserved in the Strezza tradition or not?
Obviously, there was some connections. Both Carranza, the first author I mentioned, was military. Also was a lawyer. He was a lawyer by studies. He made the lawyer degree, but he, against his merits, fighting in the Portugal campaign, when Spain incorporated Portugal and become only a one nation. And the last one, Lawrence de Rada, also started his career as a military, as a captain, and then reached the degree of colonel. But also he has an education, because probably he was educated by the Jesuits in Madrid. And he has a very strong knowledge of geometry, of artillery, also for humanities, because his books are full of references to classical authors. So we see that both these important authors are both using the feather and the sword. This was the ideal knight with the knowledge and also with the sword. It also has a military tradition. So there is interaction. Probably the military were not using destreza because destreza was mainly developed for civil use, for single rapier and to fight from one-to-one, not to a massive combat. No? But
yeah, you brought upon one of the most important topics. I think in the exploration of martial arts in general, particularly starting from the 16th century, is a relationship, divergence as well as convergence between what we call civilian martial arts and military martial arts. In this regard, using your perspective and your expert knowledge in the global Hispanic tradition of destreza, can you see a relationship between, for example, the development of this bigger destreza tradition with local traditions that started coming to being around that time or slightly later? I am particularly interested in the Philippines because a few years ago, from my experience, I was working with a bunch of Filipino martial artists in Hong Kong. I was talking to them about their practice of eskrima, about Kali, and they said, in the past, we used sticks for practice, and then we graduate to swords. But most people don't actually know how to fight with swords, which, as we know, is fundamentally different. So I was very intrigued to hear about Zapata, who was born in the Philippines and actually had a Filipino father. Please enlighten me.
Yeah, this is a very hot topic because the Philippine martial arts actually is, as you told before, there is some kind of official recognition of Filipino martial arts. There are some governmental support, and there is, a tradition. There is a lot of discussion if there is Spanish influence or not. There is a very interesting work by Rollo. This is developed substantial work, in which is exploring all references of the Filipino martial arts, and also trying to find the relationship with the Spaniards.
Sorry, Manu, if I can just jump in here. Do we know of the existence of a corpus of literature in the Philippines?
Yes.
There is?
Yes. Wow. Yes, but it's not clear a relationship with the Spaniards. Probably there were more relationship with the military fencing, but not with destreza. But what we know of Filipino martial arts, probably there were people that have some kind of military instruction, but they are obviously in Philippines the Spanish was used for some times or for some part of the population, and there are terminology that is taken for the Spanish, but the system is not similar to the destreza system.
Okay, I think this is a long conversation you and I can have over many bottles of wine. Just opening up to the other panelists, I would very much like to hear your view, not necessarily on globalization, but on martial arts exchanges between societies, different geographical regions and countries, citing the specific country or area that you're familiar with. Daniel, would you like to go first?
Thank you. I would like to use this opportunity to point out that there are different behavior that we can have towards this cultural identity. People are claiming, we talked about legacies or lineage, to be part of a cultural identity, and there are people actively saying, no, I'm looking at something that should be efficient, and I want to measure that efficiency on competition. And we know that it cannot be measured on competition. So this is interesting to observe that there are people actively choosing to agree or disagree with this idea. I think as scholars or martial art practitioners, we can see the benefits or the disadvantages of this point of view. But what is interesting is that it's also in connection with marketing. So if we move these historical issues, interesting in comparative studies between the corpuses and the arts we practice, to nowadays we have to to take into consideration the question of marketing and rivalries.
Yeah, Daniel, I think you raise a very relevant point. That is that at any given moment, and indeed in most societies and cultural contexts, different people have a fundamentally different approach and perception of martial arts.
Yes.
So even within one cultural setting, in a place like Taiwan, for example, how one person to the other, how they look at martial art, the definition and hence the practice could vary very considerably. Okay, thank you, Daniel, for that. Going back to history, I'll throw it to Eric.
Thank you. Well, we can see that even the fencing masters of Germany had many exchanges with other fencing masters. For example, one of the Italian masters, you could name them Fiore de Liberi, he names his teachers, and one of them is Swabian. So one of them is Johannes from Swabia. So there are also exchanges. There are no borders in the Middle Ages, but there are exchanges in between cultures and in between courts and societies. And if we're looking, I presented earlier the lineage of Master Lichtenauer, and if you look at the origin of all these masters he enumerates, it's a vast territory in which they must have lived in, and they met to exchange on martial arts. So I think at the same time, a practice that is shared is also something that could unite people in order to exchange embodied knowledge and to learn from each other. They must not have, engaged in actually violent conflict, but also in mutual exchange. So I think there is, we can see as people who are professional martial artists now and then are interested in what other people practice, what they do, what they know. This is always a chance to interact and to meet on a common ground, which is basically it's beyond languages, because you can interact with someone with your body and not need to know the language.
Thank you, Eric. Once again, a wonderful point about human agency. I think martial arts, one of those disciplines or knowledge systems where the individual really often has a definitive impact on the development, conservation, and direction of a specific style or weapon, more than most sciences and most disciplines. Thank you for that. Just bringing the discussion back to this part of the world, I would like to turn to Mr. Liu. I will ask my question in English, and then I'll repeat in Chinese, so that the other panelists can follow. Just going back to what I was asking the other panelists a little earlier, I would like to collect your insights. Manuel has already talked about quite extensively previously and elaborated a bit further on the impact of globalization and how globalization had been an instrument in the development of Destrezza as really one of the earliest globalized martial arts systems. But looking sort of more geographically into this part of the world, China historically has had a very strong cultural exchange with Japan, with Korea, with Mongolia, Vietnam, and the Ryukyu. And I want you to talk in particular about the manuscript, the beautiful manuscript you have on the first floor, the so-called Ryukyu Bubishi. 我用中文慢一点。之前我们大家谈了很多全球性对于武术的发展的影响，尤其是刚才曼佑他从研究西班牙或者是那个西班牙系统的那个 Destrezza 做一个例子，怎么构建了一个从17世纪开始构建了一个全球化的这样的一个武艺体系，很早在近现代时候就已经做了这个东西，跟菲律宾啊、墨西哥啊，包括台湾啊、日本啊等等都形成那个交流，甚至把很多东西保留了下去。那么我们眼看东亚地区，中国一直以来跟我们周边的国家都有很密切的关系，包括谢淑芳老师也谈到了射箭方面，我们很多的一些普及在中国可能没有保留着的。那么我们在日本啊，在韩国，在周边的国家，我们倒是能找到。我想您用琉球武备制做一个例子，讲一下中国跟琉球在明清的时候的那个武艺交流。
从那个琉球武备制刚好是我一个很特殊的机缘之下，收到琉球武备制的一个目前算是海内外的一个彩绘的孤本。那 这个东西呢，因为是从琉球来的，一开始当然我们对它的内容是熟悉，我们一看就知道这是中国的东西。但是这个东西呢，在日本人的在那时候是琉球人的角度上来看的时候，当然琉球早期在明朝的时候有36姓的移民到琉球去，然后它有特殊形成的在那个地方形成了一个特殊的米酒村，都是中国人一个聚集的一个地方。那当然就形成一个文化。不过在当时呢，这种武术文化对他们而言是一种贵族文化，并不是一般的平民百姓是可以接触到的。然后到后期呢，从这个琉球武备制的那个内容里面开始去发展出形成后面的日本所谓其他的空手道体系的这些武术。那这个是一个比较笼统的概念，就是说，事实上琉球武备制只是传到琉球去的其中一种武术而已，它并不是只有鹤拳。那就这本书来说是因为拳谱里面分2个部分，一个是图片的部分，一个是文字的部分。那因为我们被文字的影响，它写到跟白鹤拳有关系，跟罗汉拳有关系，所以我们就很多时候是很主观直觉的认为说，这可能是福州鸣鹤，被主观的是认定是这样子。但是因为这2本书，这个拳谱本来是2个独立的系统，但是因为没有搞清楚之前，他认为是一个系统，就被误会说这个琉球武备制跟日本的空手道有关系，那就跟白鹤拳有关系。当然这个关系是一定是存在的，但是琉球武备制里面并不是说只有白鹤拳而已，它还有很多的武术在里面。它的48个对练图里面还有很多是狗拳。那狗拳这个讲法的话，就是说有人说是属于白鹤拳的那个地堂的这个系统所以我在收集这个过程里面，我自己就感觉到说还有包括因为琉球武备制的关系，很多的日本的空手道借得到中国大陆去寻根那寻根的过程里面就发生了很多文化上的一些比较奇特的那个现象，就是说他们很多东西他们是很主观的，他们从动作上去很主观认为说这个就是什么拳但事实上从
您说的很主观是中国人主观，
日本人很主观，日本人很主观，他们就认为说我们这个空手道就跟白鹤拳是源头，白鹤拳是他们的那个源头那事实上从广泛的角度上来看的话，琉球的整个武术里面并不是只有白鹤拳，它是一个比较丰富的一个系统，甚至还有一个器械的那个系统里面，它是一个比较那事实上应该是说从琉球武备制的那个来源来看，就说这本书是很特殊的，因为在这本书的内容是记载是中国武术的内容，但是在中国南方，特别是福建这个地区，找不到跟琉球武备制一样内容的鹤拳或者是南拳的拳谱，你看不到。所以为什么它是中国武术的内容，却保存在日本，在琉球这个地方，反而在中国的地方是找不到的。所以这大概几十年来解读琉球武备制的内容的专业的书籍，都是日本人写的。他们从日本的角度上来看琉球武备制所以几乎没有说从中国人的角度上来看琉球武备制这一本书。我举一个很简单的例子，就是说第一页打开了拜的那个武神田都元帅，实际上田都元帅他们今天被日本奉为是空手道界的武神，武术之神。可是田都元帅在中国福州的信仰里面，只是民间一个很普遍的信仰，它跟戏剧的戏神跟很多东西都有关联性的可是因为他们不了解中国的这种民俗的这种文化，就主观这样子的一个认定所以这是比较可惜，就是说如果未来有机会的时候，是希望说从更多中国武术的角度来解读琉球武备制，然后这个东西就是说能不能还原，就是把琉球武备制的东西还原到中国的南方去，它可以补足很多中国南方鹤拳也好或其他系统的我们遗失的资料，反而可以在琉球武备制这本拳谱里面获得一个补足。
好的，非常感谢，讲了很丰富，我不知道能翻译多少，试一下哈。
So I don't know
how well the translators are doing, but I will try to repeat, hopefully do a better job. So to begin with, Ryukyu Bubishi was created in Ryukyu. So Ryukyu was a kingdom in what is now commonly known as Okinawa. And during the Ming Dynasty, when Ryukyu was still an independent country, there was a huge amount of interaction and diplomatic and trade exchanges, mainly the Ryukyu people presenting trade, tribute to China, and China returning with gift missions. And because of this strong relationship between Ryukyu or Okinawa with China, already in the Ming Dynasty, at the request of the Ryukyu people, the Chinese sent what is commonly known as 36 clans of people from Hokkien. So Taiwan is also part of the greater Hokkien dialectic region to live in Ryukyu. So today there are a lot of what we consider to be indigenous Okinawan or Ryukyuan who are actually from China. The knowledge of Chinese martial arts for the Ryukyu people, it was quite aristocratic. So many common people would not have in the view of Mr. Liu to learning martial arts, and therefore it was the precinct of the elite, if you like, and this reflects to a certain degree to the quality of the manuscript, which is handcrafted, colored, and executed in a beautiful artistic hand. In Japan, this Ryukyu Bubishi is often regarded as the Bible of the karate. Now, there are many different karate styles which are not fully encompassed by the Ryukyu Bubishi. However, the Ryukyu Bubishi is the earliest textual evidence related to karate. Because this treatise or this work was composed by the Okinawan and now preserved in Japan, or the manuscript are basically in Japan. So the study of Ryukyu Bubishi as a philological phenomenon is also mainly a Japanese scholarly endeavor. And therefore, in recent years, over the past few decades, there is a huge amount of fair bit of Japanese subjectivity in how they interpret the movement and the culture embedded within the Bubishi. In the opinion of Mr. Liu, it doesn't pertain to one or two schools, so it's not just a white crane, which is written in name in the manuscript, and it's certainly not Arhat, not only Arhat, which is another important style present in the Minnan region, and again written into the Bubishi. But there are also other styles. So he says, going forward, it'll be very helpful if the Chinese practicing community, the Chinese martial studies community will also start to embrace the study of Bubishi as a scholarly endeavor, which will shed light on its cultural content and will shed light on the historical process of exchange between China and Okinawa in a very interesting moment in time. Just in closing on what he said, he cited one particularly interesting example in the opening frontispiece of this work. In the opening frontispiece of this work, there's an illustration of 那个叫什么元帅？田都元帅, whom in Japan, because of the reverence in which the Bubishi is being held, is almost regarded as a deity for war. But in reality, within the greater Minnan region, he is just a very fairly lowly, popular deity. So this cultural gap is also very interesting to observe. Okay, so moving forward, rather long translation. So, where we are. So if we open up to the idea of martial arts in the early modern period, starting around the turn of 16th century as a moment of important change in different parts of the world, both in the East and in the West, can we identify common factors which propel, which are the fundamental social and scientific dynamics facilitating social and military and hence martial art change? Maybe I'll first of all collect view from Europe, and then maybe I'll collect the view from China, and then I'll go to the manual for a more global view. Daniel, you'd like to go first?
Thank you. Regarding, is the early 16th century really a big change? Yes, there are many, many changes happening at that point, especially the change in the media industry. So the printing was a flourishing, but it already happened in the 15th century. What is interesting as well is the change in, well, there is a scientific revolution, but we saw this, so the profound cultural ideas and means at disposal of the whole society, including martial experts, changed, and they benefited from this very early on. So there is a change because of this. And I would also say that there is a major change happening on the battlefield. They also adapt from this. So it's a very interesting point in time to start the study. What is also interesting is that it's a broader question. So how can we consider martial arts as a form of cultural identity and expression of it? And was it already the case back then as it is now? So comparatively interesting. I don't want to go into the details here. I would just like to point out that we talked a lot about the Spanish systems, and Marco Ferrari talked about this. I would like to point another example which I found interesting. They had rivalries between the idea that the best fighting techniques don't come from I will get my line straight. Let's take the example of Silver. So he published at the very end of the 16th century, and he's an English master, and he is really critical about Italian fencing master. Why? Yes, because Italy was a center of martial diaspora. A lot of people, including the French, we know from Montaigne that the aristocratic French crossed the border to go to Italy to learn. And in the situation of Silver, actually, Italian stole his job, and he had a very peculiar idea about them. He was trying to criticize them technically, but if we read that between the lines, it was rivalry question again. So, yeah, very interesting in elements. So sorry, I was.
So you mentioned three very important factors happening sort of at different levels. One is a scientific level, so availability of printing, if we can maybe also include gunpowder or even rapid advances in development of from flintlock to matchlock and those sort of things. The second level is actual military change, so that is not just in the equipment, but also in terms of military organization, scale, financing, all of that, so-called military revolution. And the third aspect, which very few people talk about, but talked about rather extensively by different speakers today, is a cultural dimension, which I find very interesting. And again, I personally, just riding on the citation you just drew on George Silver, I will also say that if you advance another 100 years, so now we're into the 18th century, so almost 200 years, and we go to Scotland, and we find the Scots using the tartan shield with sword, and even using the big two-handed sword. They were fighting in a way that in England and many other places were already gone. Primarily because the interaction between Scotland as a rather far peninsula from the rest of Europe is quite remote, except for regular exchanges, particularly at the aristocratic level with the French. Okay, so I would like to pass now to Eric, please.
Yeah, thank you. I was thinking in the same lines that you just mentioned. So if we're looking at the developments in late medieval Europe, we already see that there are many changes happening, and that those changes are also the reason why fight books are written and why we have documentation about this. So it's basically, my question would be, who is doing the martial arts, who's practicing, and for which reasons? So we can see two developments. On the one hand, we have like burger classes rising up to power, gaining more and more financial impetus, and thus sometimes having more money at their disposal as the noblemen, especially the low nobility. And those people are striving to have the same martial knowledge as the nobility, so they take up fencing. They buy their own armors, they do jousting, they're then excluded from jousting for like dynastic reasons. So if you don't have a noble heritage, you can't participate in a joust. So they're doing their own jousts. And so this is a question of martial arts is connected to status in Europe and to agency. And at the same time, the question is, what are they practicing? So if you're looking at the noblemen and in the fight books, what is put down is basically some form of ritual dueling in full armor. And this is a practice that is no longer been done. So you're no longer, it's very, very rare that you're challenged to a formal duel. But nevertheless, the noblemen keep practicing this. They keep, sort of sticking to their cultural heritage and employing the fencing masters, which in turn turn up as experts exactly for this kind of techniques for noblemen. So there's a lot of exchange going on, and there's also like a possibility to rise up socially. So I would always say there's not only technological change which is happening, but which is also happening in this case because the ways the longsword is no longer a weapon which is actually used on the battlefield, but nevertheless it's the most well-trained weapon in the 16th and 15th and 16th century. Then it's,
Thank you,
Eric.
This
is like,
you have spoken like a true social historian and brought our attention to importance paying attention to social structures and the fact that with economic changes there was a rise of new social classes and they had their own social needs and hence constructing new social and cultural contexts for the practice of martial arts, including different types of competition and dueling and practice, etc. Thank you for that. So I will once again draw attention back to East Asia. I think the description you just gave just paved the ground perfectly for me to cast a question to Mr. Liu. We all saw this wonderful presentation last night of how martial arts are sort of presented or embodied in secret society rituals. I think everyone would like to hear more about this. 刚才我们的讨论里面呢，就谈到了在近现代，从16世纪开始，也就是说明清至时期，不同的一些核心的原因，怎么让全球的武术产生核心的变化？他们从欧洲的角度呢，就谈到了几个方面，有科学方面的元素。他们是有那个文化方面的元素，有军事方面的元素，也有社会方面的元素。那么我就想请刘老师您呢聚焦于社会的那个角度，因为从那个16、17，也就是说明清之际，我们看到中国的武艺在民间的武艺跟军旅的武艺是开始更明显的分野的那个时期。那么在台湾呢，我们可以说民间武艺在很多传统的空间以及它的一种传统是保留的很完整的。您昨天晚上给我们大家展示的那个天地会南音，让我们都很震撼。400年对外没有公开过的这样的一个武术跟传统仪式形成一体的这样的一个文化现象，让大家都受到台湾很浓厚的这个武术的文化。在这方面，请您再给我们多讲一讲。
好，谢谢赵先生。16世纪大概就是中国处于明末的那个时代。那明末对中国来说是一个非常关键的时期，就是说冷兵器慢慢开始，它的地位就是火器出现之后，冷兵器慢慢的地位就不如以前一样。那在这个时期呢，武术处于一个比较尴尬的时期，就是说，它要从军事上它的地位已经不如以前的时候，那被火器取代的中间的过程当中，武术必须找到它新的一个生存的一个空间。 那就是往民间去走。那民间武术跟军事武术，它的最基本而言，它的目的是不同的。哦，那从社会的角度上来看，我做一个大的那个方向来看的话，我把它分为一个是内向化，一个是外向化的一个趋势。那什么叫内向化跟外向化呢？如果我们以人作为一个武术的载体而言的话，外向化就是往技术方面走。所以在冷兵器时代，在军事的时代，武术的目的功能就只有一个，就是上阵杀敌，这个是唯一的一个目的。除此之外呢，没有其他的功能存在。那慢慢呢，因为这个东西慢慢被火药、被火器取代了之后，那武术该怎么办？它就会走到民间。那民间，学武的目的呢，并不是跟军事上的东西是不一样的。它的诉求才开始出现了变化。所谓的内向是什么呢？就是内向，就是回到人的这个本位。那这个人呢，指的是什么？我们的健康，所以开始出现养生的概念。所以在明末的时候，有一个东西，有一个文化现象很重要，就是易筋经的现象。易筋经可以说是一个中国武术内养文化的一个开端。那这个养呢，就是军事武术跟民间武术一个最大的一个区隔。因为军事武术是不讲养的，它讲的是强身，但是强身跟养生是两个不同的概念。哦，民间开始出现养，那因为出现这个内化内养的概念的时候，它的融合的东西就必须非常多，比如说中医，还有练气，道家的练气，甚至于更高深一点，涉及到精神层次的时候，儒家跟佛家的观念也就慢慢进来了。哦，那这样子的时候，就是武术慢慢从外向开始走到内向化的趋势的时候，它产生了很多的乱象，因为一下子武术到民间之后，不晓得武术的定位该怎么去定位它。以前在军事的时候，武术是很明确的，功能就只有一个，它是唯一的。可是武术当走到民间之后，它的参与武术的人并不一定是军人，各种人，社会的各种人士，他的不同的身份的人都可以参与这个武术的时候，那复杂化了，因为功能目的的不同，产生这样子的一个复杂化的一个现象。所以它的重心呢，就是从技术转移到人的身上，就是由外而内。哦，那这个现象呢，我们如果说从东西方的武术来看，这个有一个很明显的一个区别，就是像西方武术，我想说到至今为止，他们很强调对抗，他们这个对抗的精神是非常好的，包括那个像史诗欧洲武术、黑马这些武术的话，他们很强调这种对抗的一个精神。这个东西反而是保留着武术原始的那一种味道。虽然军事的意义已经不存在了，它的精神是存在的。那在东方，特别是中国的时候，方向是完全是往另外一个方向去发展的。那我想说，不管是内向化或外向化都好，它并不是绝对的。这个内外是一个相对性的东西。那今天我们可以看到西方很多的武术，慢慢也开始去研究东方的武术，它可能有不同的一个精神内涵的一个东西。那东方的武术，我想说近几年，包括在像广州的马明达老师，他们在推短兵跟长兵的这种对抗性的东西。我想这个是一个非常好的，就是说弥补了这个中国的这个传统武术不断走套路化跟竞技化的这个方向的时候，它可以做了一个平衡的作用。所以我想说，从16世纪以来，这个趋势到今天，事实上内向化的趋势，以中国武术而言，内向化的趋势不但没有减轻，反而是越来越严重。那如果今天我们可以适时的，像今天这种交流的场合，我们可以多认识一下西方在欧洲的各种武术的话，对于这种趋势有一种平衡的一种作用。
How was the translation? Okay. All right, that's another very long statement. Let me try. So to begin with, the 16th century corresponds to, roughly speaking, the end of the Ming Dynasty. Ming Dynasty, contrary to the Qing Dynasty, was already very advanced in the use of gunpowder and guns. So as a result of that, martial arts during the Ming Dynasty was starting to become under pressure. In his opinion, generally speaking, he could describe martial arts as internal and external, or one could say they are externalizing trend and an internalizing trend. If we take martial arts to its functional extreme, simply as a way to defend and to fight and to wage war, that is the functional aspect. That's a purely external manifestation of martial art. Not that it could probably exist in time and space in any culture, but conceptually, that's an extreme example of externalization of martial arts. The opposite of that is complete internalization. So martial arts not having a functional purpose in the sense of attacking, defense, and waging war, but rather as a cultural phenomenon. So at that time, what we started to see happening is the incorporation of other body concepts into Chinese martial arts, starting with what we call Chinese yogic practices. So things like Yi Jing Jing, Ba Duan Jing, such practices then started to become merged with Chinese martial arts. And just as Emmanuel said, the Strezza is also an embodiment of religious, scientific, and other principles. So Chinese martial arts went even further than that in terms of the appropriation and martial arts as the physical embodiment of cultural concepts, not tending towards combat, but for cultural meaning. Unfortunately, a negative effect of that is Chinese martial arts, as Professor Ma Mingda already said is in his opening keynote address, is that over time, as martial arts became divorced and became increasingly distant from practical use, it's starting to lose its spirit. So if we compare that to what we see happening in Europe, both historically at the time when the divergence between military and civil martial arts was happening, the transition into a sport or dueling and other adversarial competitive phenomena was very present and continued to be present in martial arts practice in Europe today. In China, we're still struggling to find that balance. As Ma Mingda said, the opportunity to engage with the Western world, the appropriation of Western sport as a concept in China. This has enabled us to provide a counterbalance, and as is the opportunity to exchange ideas with you guys and to learn what's happening in the indigenous martial arts space within Europe. I hope I got that right. No one's telling me about timekeeping. I have a feeling we must be close to the hour point. So maybe I can just gradually bring this discussion to a close. We can probably talk for another 2 hours and extend this into another exhibition and another conference. But perhaps I just ask a comment from each of the panelists, starting with Eric and then ending with Daniel, on what you think is the significance of martial arts exchange and what are the takeaways. Of course, we still have another afternoon session to follow.
Yeah, thank you very much. So my takeaway points would be to see how diverse martial arts culture is and how important it is at the same time for practical reasons, and that it always has like several points of reference. There is this individual point of reference, like the individual who's practicing the art, who are the individuals who are interacting to learn from other people and to culturally exchange. But at the same time, there's this national or this cultural impact of martial arts, which is at the same time very important. And as you said, I'm looking at this from a perspective of a social historian. So this is for me the most important factor, and also to see how many similarities there are between Asian martial arts, especially Chinese martial arts, and European martial arts. I think we can learn a lot about comparison and exchanges.
Thank you. Manuel?
Thank you. I think that this barriers between different styles, nationalistic or performance because today we have, and this is very important, this meeting, because we see that many things we are doing the same thing or similar things, and we need to learn from this, because sometimes we are making errors and improving our techniques or making our systems, and we can learn from others not to commit the same errors. Thank you.
And we've all learned a lot from you about the first global martial arts system. Thank you for that, Manuel. 刘老师，请您讲几句，觉得武艺交流在历史跟当今的，尤其是当今，它的重要性是什么？
它的重要性从今天的场合就可以看到。我们今天中午的时候在跟几个朋友，台湾这边的专家学者聊到，而且是资深的，在对台湾这个武术界对台湾武术史非常有研究的那个专家老师们，他提出的一件事情就是说，我们今天这个活动这个场合是台湾的第一次。说台湾很少有针对武术这个主题来举办学术研讨会的，然后甚至于说是跨国的、国际性的，这绝对是台湾的第一次。那第一次来说是非常重要的，但它是对于未来台湾武术发展要怎么走、该怎么走，这个是非常重要的一件事情。因为我想说，大部分的我们的武术界从事武术活动是比较频繁的，但是武学活动是比较薄弱的。所以我想说，今天这样的场合，我们一下子把这个层级跟规格拉得非常高。我想说，慢慢的去累积，可能不晓得要走多久。我想说，先拉到一个高度之后，慢慢再来做了，再来反省，再来检讨，我们再如何进步。我想这个是今天我们办这个活动非常有意义的一件事情。
Mr. Liu said in Taiwan there are many martial arts activities, but seldom are there conferences on martial studies. So taking it to the academic level is rare, but it's even rarer that not only do we have assembled here a bunch of scholars and researchers, but more particularly it's an international event where we have a transnational discourse and exchange on commonalities and differences, and for him it's very inspiring and will hopefully propel Taiwan to the next stage of development in terms of martial arts, martial studies. Thank you. Daniel.
Thank you. A key interest in mine is considering martial arts as cultural form of expression, and I am amazed every time I visit your conferences and I visit conferences around the world how similar and dissimilar I'm always learning about others and notifying that bringing together such an expert audience, practitioners and researchers, professional, amateur researchers, it's very rich. It's very rich, and this will give me a lot of things to take away.
Gentlemen, thank you very much. I've really enjoyed that discussion. We've covered now the first two topics of today. One is focusing more on the book itself, the transmission of knowledge through books and the relation between books and martial arts. The second section really deals with what we have been discussing over the past hour, which is exchange, regional exchange, inter-ethnic exchange, international exchange, global exchange. The third section to come after the break will be about other areas extending into the oral traditions as well as technology. So thank you all. Please enjoy your break.
Thank you.
We've had a very long day of presentations. I hope you've all had a good time, but the purpose of squeezing out these 15 minutes really get a bit of interactivity into the proceedings. So questions can be asked to the three of us on stage, obviously, but also to the speakers.
Okay. I have a question for Mr. Jacquet. So in your speech, you're talking about that some master, He specifically asked like a professional artist to make the drawing in the treatise. So that must be very important to him. So okay, I'm ex-Ali from for Now Society of HEMA, and I've been studying treatises from Latin art tradition for years, and so it is to my observation that sometimes that most delicate drawing does not reveal the truth, because the artists themselves might not be practicing, right? So take, for example, so this is a stance from people making thrust. So maybe in a very delicate drawing, it's like this. And so from Ringack's treatise, the same move is being drawn like this. So, but in Ringack's treatise, is that the drawing is very poorly drawn. So the question is, what's your opinion that the assumption maybe the bad drawing maybe show more truth?
Thank you for your questions. I will try to answer in brevity. There is a great article by Sidney Anglo who looked exactly at that point. I don't know if you have it, I can give it to you. My personal view is that I try to stay away as possible as analyzing images. The first fight books complains. So usually when you realize, when you produce a manuscript, sometimes it's done in different phases, and when professional artists are involved, they may not be martial artists. They may have seen, but they may not have practiced. And the first fight book author says there are mistakes in the illustrations, and that is the mistake of the painters. So that means that there is distrust already between the martial expert and the people who actually draw. Some other martial experts said, I have drawn myself. But you can doubt this because some of them, they didn't have the skills. So obviously, it's a very interesting question into the history and how it was produced. Sometimes there is a disconnection, sometimes there is a connection. Did I answer your question?
Yes, thank you very much.
I just want to add my own opinion that whether in the European tradition or in the Chinese or Eastern tradition, illustrations are meant to be helpful. But the degree to which we can actually consider them accurate really depends. There's a very wide spectrum. As Daniel was saying in his presentation earlier, there are masters who really push it to the point of hyper-realism. So they're meant to be illustrative. And if I can extend it to contemporary practice in what I do with the living archive and with the use of motion capture, we use technology, and drawing at the time was the most advanced form of illustration possible to help the people interacting with this text to understand what's been written. And as we saw from Dr. Burkhardt earlier, some students of earlier masters also interpreted the teachings, the mnemonic rhymes, etc., and ran them into illustrations to help the process. And it's the same processes that we also see in Chinese manuals. So I think, there's really a wide spectrum, but these illustrations are meant to be helpful.
Thank you, Mr. Chow. Thank you. Any more questions, please?
Yeah. Today is a really great conference that most of the experts are on the stage to share about the development of the Western weapons in the China martial arts development. And one question from me is that the Western side of the weapon development and the China, the weapon development, is there any exchange between them? I mean, the China side to affect the Western side of the weapon, or at any time in the history that the Western side affect the China side weapons? And can you give us the cases and example?
Yes. talking about the impact of weaponry from the West impacting development in the East, the most obvious one is firearms. So as we have seen in the 16th century, as the Portuguese and the Spanish started to sail to East Asia, they had a transformative impact on the way in which we related to weapons, particularly in Japan. So the use of firearms, particularly by the warlord Oda Nobunaga, had a definitive impact on the course of Japanese history. And at the same time, Japanese warriors started to imitate the style of Western armor, including the Spanish and Portuguese morion, as well as the cuirass. So this redounded to a basic change in the design of Japanese arms and armor.
Thank you.
Thank you. 目前还有没有其他的问题呢？我们这一位先生，我们拿一个麦克风，在右边，谢谢。
你好，我有问题想要请教刘老师，另外有可能也需要那个谢淑芳老师他回答关于这个传统中国射箭的问题。那我们有提到说，就是我知道刘老师跟谢淑芳老师都有收集很多的武学的这个资料，尤其是关于射箭这方面的。那我心中是一直认为说，我们现在所谓的传统射箭、中华射箭，其实都是属于清代的，比如说跟蒙古的那种射箭是比较类似的。那我心中一直有个疑问，就是我们汉人的射箭究竟还有没有留存在？那我曾经听过一个说法，就是韩国的射箭，他们是从我们的明朝传过去的，主要是用我们的小烧弓。但是我看到韩国他们的射法、他们的战法跟我们是完全不一样的。我们一般的战法的话是这边是目标，大概我们是这个样子站的，但是韩国的是这样子，然后侧身。那我想知道说，就是刘老师或者谢淑芳老师，你们在文献上面，然后有没有看到描述这方面的差异？谢谢。
Okay, I'll just make a very quick translation into English. So the question is directed to Mr. Liu and to Mr. Selby about archery books, because he's enthusiast, I believe, in Chinese archery, and in his knowledge, he's been mainly exposed to Chinese tradition. So the first question is, he's not familiar with early tradition of non-Manchu origin. That's first point. Second point is, he also would like to understand a bit more as to how much the Korean tradition, which has a deep historical relationship with China, to what extent does it actually reflect earlier Chinese practices, and to what degree do they differ?
这个问题我必须请谢淑芳教授来回答，因为我虽然有收了一些古谱，但是对射箭方面的东西的内容上面我是外行，所以我把这个问题就请谢淑芳教授来为您回答，谢谢。
好，谢谢。按照我的理解呢，明代的时候呢，有人有这样的记载说，明朝已经有14个派别是射箭的，14个，其中我们所知道的不会太多了，因为我们主要看到的明代的那个射箭技术，会记载在程宗筠或者在武备要略，还有射学正宗这些书，这是记载明朝的其中一个派别的射法，我都觉得可能韩国的那个传统射箭的那个方式，应该是比较接近于明朝的传统，但是他们有一些特点，因为他们这些那个习惯，就是他那个箭靶放在特别远的距离，100多米、120米。那么这个情况呢，也是影响到他们 射箭的方式。我们所知道清代的就是刚才我在演讲中都提到的是，他们主要是在武科举那方面来学习，他们都是报考那个武科，对吗？那么这个武科呢，它这个要求是很特殊的，并不是战场的。我在其中一本书，这是那个射艺精良那本书，它那个考试的正确的战法、拉法、射放的方法都是特别讲究，但是他另外再加一句，他说面对敌人在战场不同于考试。你在战场，你所有在这本书记载的东西，你不要理它，就要快，啊，就是好像是是用力要快，其他我们不理呀，所以就是这个情况呢，就是他们的那个射箭的目的是什么？是考试还是战场？所以先生刚才提的问题就比较复杂，我不想多讲，但是我的分析是这样的，是可能是理由是：第一是哪个派别，第二是打仗的还是考试的，都会影响到这个问题。
Do you want to translate for yourself?
Oh, very quickly, very quickly. The question was, what we see now is often Qing style. What was the Ming style? And is it still represented in Korean archery, which has special features? And the answer is it's complicated by two factors. One, in the Ming, there were at least 14 different styles of archery, of which only one or two are recorded in the Ming books. In the Qing, there was only really one style of archery, which was that which was required for the national examination. And it's clearly said that the method in the examination should not be used on the battlefield because you'll die. Okay, so we've got these 2, 3, 4 aspects to take into account. It's difficult to answer the question exactly. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Shelby. Thank you, Mr. Shelby. Thank you, Mr. Chow. Thank you, Mr. Jacque. Thank you, Mr. Liu. Are there any more questions? Oh, we have one more. Sorry.
我想请问谢树芳老师，一个射箭的技巧。以前我跟一位刘和北老师学画，他提到说溥心怡先生，他是受过宫廷教育的人，也学过射箭。他说，为了这个手肘啊，这个地方不会受伤，所以在推弓的时候，这个手肘是朝天，然后射出去的时候是这样的，把这个手肘翻过来，然后这羽毛呢就不会插到了这个肌肉，而一翻转之后，这羽毛就离开了。这段文章呢，在《溥心怡记》里面，就是王嘉诚先生写的这一个《溥心怡传》里面的一段，所以我第一次听刘和北老师告诉我是口述，第二次呢是看传记的。请问谢树芳老师，您有没有听过清朝末年的时候还有这样的射箭方式，就是推弓的时候，这个手肘就翻过来，然后呢收回来，再推出去。他说这样的话呢比较稳定，而且有力。以上请问谢老师，谢谢。
Can we please give the microphone to Mr. Shelby?
It's a technical question, so I'm not going to answer.
Yes, I would hate to hijack your discussion. Would you like me to answer the gentleman at the end privately, or do you want me to try and...
It's a relatively simple question, so I think you can probably answer
Yes. Please remember for Chinese archery, the concern, firstly I should explain for those who are not archers, that in modern times there's a concern that when you release the string, you hit your arm and hurt yourself. This is a false assumption. The real concern was that your clothes would get in the way of the string. It was not a matter of whether it would be hurt you or not. In the Qing style, your shoulder is down. You'll hold the bow, they say, like an egg, and you push your finger forward to touch the arrowhead. When the arrowhead touches your finger, then you are fully drawn if the arrow is the right length. So the problem of whether your arm is with this 肘窝 pointing up or sideways is actually a question of stopping your shoulder coming up. It's that question. It's not a question of stopping the string from hitting your arm. 我不翻译吧。
不用翻译了。我觉得这刚才肢体动作已经是讲得很清楚了。
看动作的可以吧？
对。
We are going to wrap up our Q&A, and thank you, Mr. Shelby, thank you, Mr. Chow, thank you, Mr. Liu, thank you, Dr. Jiao Kui.
I think the next section is for Daniel to
do a wrap up.
To do a wrap up. Before passing the microphone to Daniel, I just want to address fellow speakers. Thank you all for being here, particularly for our friends who have to come a long way from different parts of Europe. Your presence here, it's much appreciated, and you've lightened up the venue and enlightened the audience. I do have a request. If possible, I would like to have your paper within the next month, please, because we are looking to publish a proceeding sometime this year, so the editors have to start to work. Thank you.
So I promise this will not last more than 10 minutes. Can we have live Chinese translation, possibly? Yes, thank you. So I've attempted a wrap-up in the following form, just a few data in the beginning, setting the goals of the both conference organizers, and then I have mapped 5 questions which stand out overall the 11 presentations that we had today. So today we had 11 sessions with international speakers and martial experts. We had live, remote, and pre-recorded presentation with live translation. It was part of the Taiwan International Martial Studies Summit, so tomorrow it continues. And it was also in connection with the exhibition, The New Silk Road of Martial Studies. The goals this morning, well, the subtitle of the conference, the 5th edition of this International Martial Studies Conference, Transcultural Perspective on Martial Arts Development and Transmission in the Early Modern Period. This morning, in the opening address, Mr. Liu told about this new Silk Road of martial arts, a comparison between East and West. And today we traveled between East, West, and we also traveled through time. So all of these questions, the key questions I've identified are within this travel. In the organizer's view, Mr. Yu Keng and Yi and Hing Chao, so 3 goals were set this morning. First, it was the research in the field, then the sharing the results, and then support others to achieve the same outputs. I think these goals were met today. The questions I have mapped. So, how to define martial arts heritage? We've seen through the different presentations, a following question is what to do about it. We went through inside and outside perception of this definition, that is how to define martial heritage in between experts, in between practitioners, and between non-specialists, sometimes very different discourses. It has also to do with institutionalization, that is combat sports, sport authorities, and national identities, and with Mrs. Hu's presentation and also others, the creation of martial art heritage today. That includes also the role of being the recipient of a martial tradition, an oral one. Second questions, martial contexts. Does the context affect practice? So we've seen some divide or opposed contexts like military and civilian, and martial art versus combat sport, big topic. The Dong and Jing in the opening keynote of Professor Ma Mingda, and also some discussion about mainstream and peripheral practices and underlying the richness of diversification or the importance of this. So it's difficult to reduce in one, and it's also difficult to have it widespread. Third questions, the social recognition of the martial expert. So who gives the right to the title, the master, today and back then, and in the East and in the West? What's the meaning of the title for the specialist and for the non-specialist? What's the social benefit of the master, and how does he establish authority? We discussed with the lineage and also with Dr. Burkhardt the self-fashioning aspect, also across different presentations, very rich. How to transmit embodied knowledge, especially the role of the written media in the process. So we talked a lot today across different presentations of the communication strategies that we find in our primary source material. We talked about the limits of the media and the interpretation issues on the study of this. The room for the interpretation of the primary source, may they be objects, documents, or iconography. And nowadays also video and audiovisual material. And also the underlying question of the representativity of these teachings. So we are focused on what we have left, what has survived. How does this reflect the reality back then? Last one, the influence or the imitation or the innovation in the cross or transcultural exchanges. So we talked a lot about importing and exporting martial heritage. We discussed the role of the national identity versus the cultural expression. And we also talked about the globalization of these martial heritage. What are the benefits and what are the biases? Thank you for your participation. Feel free to engage with the speakers and contact the conference organizers should you have any follow-up questions. And as expressed by Mr. Hing Chao, I would like to join. Thank you all for today. It was very rich for me. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you, Dr. Jacquet.